Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Nun Hey contains no less than 4 Mishnayos. From the beginning of the Daf till the first Mishnah is concluding the discussion about doing malacha on Tisha B'Av. The next Mishnah discusses the halachos of doing malacha on Erev Pesach, specifically focusing on the night leading into Erev Pesach. The Gemara will discuss the details of that halacha. The second Mishnah discusses if you begin malachos during the time that's permitted, are you allowed to conclude them on Erev Pesach after it's already supposed to be forbidden? And the third Mishnah will discuss specific malachos that can or cannot be done on Erev Pesach. The Gemara will be comparing Erev Pesach to Chol HaMoed and how they have different or similar halachos. The last Mishnah is the last few lines of the daf, which we'll save for tomorrow. So first of all, we're discussing doing malacha on a Tisha B'Av. So we had seen in our previous Mishnah that Talmidei Chachamim don't do malacha on Tisha B'Av in any place, in any location, irrespective of the minig. And Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says everybody's allowed to act like a Talmid Chacham here and not do malacha on Tisha B'Av. It's not considered to be yuhara. It's not considered to be being boastful by behaving like a Talmid Chacham if you're not somebody that would ordinarily be considered to be a Talmid Chacham. So Gemara says this was the opinion of Shimon ben Gamliel, but the Rabbanan seem to say that you can't. You'll look like you're boasting. It'll look like yuhara if you take on this meaning of Talmidei Chachamim. So that means that Shimon ben Gamliel is not worried about looking like you're boasting, and the Chachamim say that you do look like you're boasting. The Gemara says, well, there's a different halacha where those opinions are reversed. How do we fit the two together? What's that halacha? The halacha is that a chassan on the night of his wedding does not have to say Kriya Shema. And the reason he shouldn't is because he's too busy thinking about the wedding and what comes afterward, and therefore he cannot focus on being makabel al malchus shamayim, which is a necessary element of saying Kriya Shema properly. Therefore, he shouldn't or he couldn't say Kriya Shema on the night. Now the question is, if he wants to, is he allowed to? And over there we see the opposite opinions. Of Shimon ben Gamliel over there says you can't claim that you're able to concentrate and focus. You'll look like you're a Baal Gaiva. You'll look like you're who knows what, and therefore you can't take Kriya Shema on the night of your wedding. And the Chachamim say, no, you could, it's fine. You don't look like you're a Baal Gaiva, you don't need to worry about it. So here we see the opinions are inverted. So the Gemara has two approaches to resolve the two. The Gemara's first one is Rabbi Yochanan, who as usual says it's a mistake. One of the opinions are switched, you have to switch one of them so the two line up. The Gemara says, not necessarily. Rav Shisha Breder of Edi says you could fit them together because there's very different situations here. The first of all, in the case of the Kriya Shema, everybody else around is saying Shema. The chassan is supposed to be doing differently, and what he'll be doing if he ignores the halacha and he does the things, he'll be doing the same as everyone else. When you're doing the same as everyone else, you should be doing differently, but now you're doing the same as everyone. It doesn't look like you're showing off. You're not showing off. You're doing what everybody else does. Your situation happens to be different, and therefore you should be exempt, but now you're doing what's common that doesn't look like you're boastful. Here, however, in the case of Tisha B'Av, if everybody else is doing malacha and you're gonna not, then you're singling yourself out, you're being different, then you do look like you're boastful, and that is why the Chachamim would say that Kriya Shema you could do like everyone else even though you shouldn't, and Tisha B'Av you cannot act differently than everyone else. Now Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says the opposite. He says, look, Kriya Shema, if you'll be saying Shema, you're doing something actively which you're not supposed to be doing. That's showing off. People will look at you and say, what is this guy doing saying Shema? And therefore that's showing off. Here, however, if you're just withholding from malacha, nobody's going to look at you and say you're showing off because they'll think you just don't have a job, you don't have what to do. The fact you're not doing malacha is because you don't have anything. It's not an active participation in doing something special. It's just resisting, and that is not called showing off. Now we get the next Mishnah, which returns to the halachos of doing malacha on Erev Pesach. As we have seen previously, there are differing minhagim about doing malacha on Erev Pesach before Chatzos. After midday, everybody agrees you don't do malacha at all on Erev Pesach. The question is, what about from sunup until Chatzos? So the Mishnah here fills in where those differing minhagim are. In Yehuda, the region of Israel called Yehuda, they did malacha in the first half of the day. In the Galil, they did not do malacha. That's the first half of our Mishnah. Then the Mishnah brings a Machakas Beis Hillel Meshamei about the night before, the night of B'dikas Chametz, the night leading into the 14th. What is the halacha there? And Beis Shammai says it is forbidden to do work, and Basil says it is permitted. So the Gemara right away jumps on this. The Gemara says, hold on a second. We were talking about minhagim. We were talking about customs, where they restricted themselves from doing work and where they didn't. How did Basil and Beis Shammai get into talking about where it's permitted or forbidden? Nobody said anything about permitted or forbidden here. There is no isser, it's just minhagim. So Gemara says the issue of whether malacha on Erev Pesach is a minig or an isser is a machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, and therefore the first half of this Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, who says that it's a question of minig, and the second half is Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it's a question of isser. So that's why you have the first half discussing minhagim and the second half discussing isser. Where do you see this difference between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir? So the Gemara says, you see it in the following brisa, which quotes the machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, but doesn't seem to be any difference between them. And the difference is whether it's a question of minig or isser. What does the brisa say? So the brisa begins with Rabbi Yehuda, who says that there are different regions. In Yehuda they did malacha on Erev Pesach before Chatzos, and in the Galil they did not, just like our Mishnah, the first half of our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says to him, what are you talking to me about Yehuda and Galil? Some places you have the minig to do malacha, and some places you don't have the minig to do malacha. Gemara says, what? How is it any different? He gives the names of the places, and he doesn't give the names of the places. That's a machlokas. Gemara says the difference is, Rabbi Meir used the words custom. He said they have the custom to do. Rabbi Yehuda was talking about isser. So that's the machlokas. Is it permitted or is it aser? The Gemara now asks, according to this, Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's permitted to do malacha on Erev Pesach in the first half of the day in Yehuda. The Gemara says, I'm going to show you somewhere where Rabbi Yehuda clearly seems to indicate that it's forbidden to do malacha at all on Erev Pesach, and how will you understand that? So what we're going to do here is we're going to show this brisa, which seems to indicate that Rabbi Yehuda holds the way, and then we'll give 4 potential ways of resolving it. So the brisa is discussing what happens when you're weeding the weeds out from between your grain. You're growing a grain field, and it's a few days before the carbon ha'omer is brought. The halacha is that the carbon ha'omer, when that's brought, it matirs, it makes permitted to eat any grain which has already taken root. Now what happens is this guy's weeding, and he accidentally pulls out one of the growing grain plants, and he wants to stick it back in. The problem is if he doesn't stick it back in fast enough, or in a place where it'll take root again, then it'll take root too late. It'll be after the carbon omer, and you'll have one grain stuck in your entire grain field, which is aser, because after the carbon omer is brought, this thing is aser because everything else took root already before, but he pulled this one out when he was weeding and stuck it back in. It hasn't re-rooted yet. So therefore, you should only stick it back in if it has enough time to take root again. So, says Rabbi Yehuda, if the guy's weeding on the 13th of Nisan, then he could stick it back in a soft, muddy earth. Then it'll take root. If it's in dry earth, it won't take root fast enough. Now, Gemara says, why does he say that it has to be on the 13th of Nisan? We see elsewhere that Rabbi Yehuda holds it takes 3 days for a plant to take root. Therefore, if he was weeding even on the 14th, he has 3 days. The carbon omer is brought on the 16th. So he has part of the 14th, the whole 15th, part of the 16th. He has 3 days, or at least part of 3 days. We know the halacha is miktasiyim kekule, part of days counts like a whole day, and therefore he would have 3 days. So the same halacha could be said even if he's weeding on the 14th. Why does it say that he was weeding on the 13th? It must be, says the Gemara, that Rabbi Yehuda says you can't be weeding and sticking back in on the 14th because you're not allowed to do malacha on the 14th at all. That is difficult with what we said previously, that Rabbi Yehuda says that according to the people in Yehuda, you are allowed to do malacha on the first half of the day, the 14th. So the Gemara offers 4 resolutions. The Gemara first of all says maybe we're talking about in the Galil. Rabbi Yehuda was referring to here in the Galil, where you're not allowed to do malacha anywhere. The Gemara says that still won't help necessarily, because what about at night? Why couldn't you be weeding the night leading into the 14th? Even in Galil they hold you're allowed to do malacha then. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe because we're going like Beis Shammai, it says you're not allowed to do malacha then in the Galil. The Gemara gives another answer. Nobody weeds at night. You can't say you're weeding at night. Nobody weeds in the field at night. The Gemara's final answer is to say that it's not in the Galil specifically, it's anywhere. If you were weeding on the 14th, you would not have 3 days. It wouldn't count as 3 days. Why not? Because you can't use partial day like whole day twice. You can't say I have part of the 14th and part of the 16th. You know what that means? It means if you have one full day plus a little piece before and a little piece after, you'll say, oh, I have 3 days. The plant took root. That might work for some halachas, but it doesn't work for plants taking root. Plants take time to take root. You can't cut off that time. You want to say one partial day counts like a full day, fine. So then you could say you were weeding on the 13th, and then you have the whole 14th, the whole 15th, and part of the 16th. But don't tell me you were weeding on the 14th and you have part of the full days. That cannot be. That would not work. But now we begin the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens if you started work before the 14th. Are you allowed to finish it? That's the first half of the Mishnah. The second half is 3 or 4 exceptions to the rule of not doing malacha. So the first half of the Mishnah says as follows. Rabbi Meir says that if you started malacha before the 14th, you're allowed to finish it on the 14th, but you're not allowed to start malacha on the 14th, even if you're able to fit it in all on the 14th and finish it. You cannot start any malacha then. Now, second half is the Chachamim who say that there are 3 exceptions to the rule of not doing malacha on the 14th of Nisan, and Rabbi Yehuda says there are 4 exceptions. The 3 that they agree on are tailors, barbers, and washermen or women, and Rabbi Yehuda adds shoemakers. Okay, the Gemara will analyze these 2 halves of the Mishnah one by one. First of all, when we say that you're allowed to finish malacha but you're not allowed to start it, what about the factor of is that malacha needed for the Yom Tov or not? Does that make a difference? The Gemara has 3 possibilities. The Gemara first of all says, yes, we were only saying that it's when we said that you're allowed to finish but not start, we're only referring to malacha which is not needed for Yom Tov, but if it was needed, you'd be allowed to even start. Or we were only referring to a malacha which is needed for Yom Tov, but if it was not needed, you wouldn't even be allowed to start. Or it doesn't make a difference. The factor of needed for Yom Tov or not makes no difference. Either way, you can't start, but you could finish. Right? So that's what we want to know. Where does the halacha of the factor of needing for Yom Tov, does that make a difference to make you allowed to start? Does it make a difference that you can't start? You can't even finish if you don't need it for Yom Tov, or it makes no difference. So the Gemara tries to bring 3 proofs to this. It'll be 3 different versions of the same brisa, each with added information, which will take us closer to a solid understanding of are we referring to when you need it for Yom Tov or you don't need it for Yom Tov. So our first proof is from a brisa, which is very similar to the one we have here. It says that you could finish malacha, but you can't start. But it adds an example. It says even if you're making a very small belt or a small hairnet. So the Gemara says, what's the even? Pashas is the even means to say, even though you need those things for Yom Tov, you still can't start them. So we see that we were referring to even things which you need for Yom Tov, you're still not allowed to start. The Gemara says, no, that's not what it meant. It just meant that those things are very small and they're easy to make. And you may think, by the time I started them, I already finished them, and therefore I should be allowed to even start. No, it makes no difference. But it doesn't tell you whether needed for Yom Tov makes a difference in the issue or not. Could be that needed for Yom Tov you're not allowed to start, just as if it's not needed for Yom Tov you're not allowed to start. The Gemara now brings another brisa which is very similar, except that it adds a detail. Here Rabbi Meir says specifically we're talking about something which is needed for Yom Tov, and it brings the example again of the small belt or the hairnet, and it says you're allowed to finish the work, you're not allowed to start the work. So it would seem to imply only because it's needed for Yom Tov is the reason that you're allowed to start, otherwise that you're allowed to finish, otherwise you wouldn't even be allowed to finish. So Gemara says not necessarily, maybe only what we mean to say is that something which is needed for even something which is needed for Yom Tov, you're not allowed to start. But it's for sure true that whether it is needed for Yom Tov or not, you're still allowed to finish. Okay, the Gemara says, well, I'll bring you a third brisa, and this one is explicitly clear. It says, Rabbi Meir says, any malacha which you needed for Yom Tov, you're allowed to finish, and if it's not needed for Yom Tov, you're not allowed to finish. So you see that is specifically discussing something which is needed for Yom Tov either way. Now, this brisa ends off, and it says that we're talking about a place where the minig is that you're not allowed to do malacha. That's where you're not allowed to do malacha here. So obviously we're referring to a place where there is an Isser malacha, and you're generally not allowed to do malacha, and yet it specifically says that it's only something which is needed for Yom Tov which you're allowed to finish, and if it's not needed for Yom Tov, you're not allowed to start. But if it will be something which is not needed for Yom Tov, you're not allowed to start. That is clear. Okay, now the Gemara analyzes the second half of the Mishnah, where we had a list of 3 specific jobs which you are allowed to do on Erev Pesach, and a machlok is about the 4th. So the Gemara explains that each of these, the reason why you're allowed to do them on Erev Pesach is because there's a certain extent in which you're allowed to do them even on Chol HaMoed. If you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed, you're certainly allowed to do it on Erev Pesach itself, which is lighter. Where do you see them? So as follows. Tailors, the Gemara says, that a person who is not an expert tailor is allowed to sew on Chol Hamoed. Only if it's your job, you're not allowed to, and therefore anybody's allowed to sew on Erev Yom Tov. Haircuts, because people who come traveling from overseas and people who get out of jail just before on Yom Tov are allowed to take a haircut on Chol Hamoed, and they're also allowed to wash clothing, so that explains why haircuts and clothing washers are allowed as well. Now, the question is shoemakers. So there's a machlokus. The Gemara explains that the machlokus is as follows. People who came to be Oler Regel, and therefore they did a lot of walking and their shoes ripped just before Yom Tov, or on Yom Tov, they're allowed to fix their shoes on Chol Hamoed. The question is, do we learn from fixing shoes to making shoes? Is a shoemaker allowed to make shoes in the first place before Yom Tov because he would be allowed to fix it on Yom Tov? One says you're allowed to learn making shoes from fixing shoes. The other one says no, you're allowed to fix shoes on Chol Hamoed. You cannot learn from there that you're allowed to make shoes before Yom Tov. You'd only be able to learn from there that you're allowed to fix shoes before Yom Tov on Erev Yom Tov, not any further than that. We now begin the third Mishnah on the Daf, and here we are listing specific malachas that you are not allowed to do, and again we're going to have to be applying them both to Erev Pesach and to Chol Hamoed. So the Mishnah says as follows: 3 types of malachas which you may be allowed to do are sitting chickens or doves on eggs, mucking out stalls, that means removing the waste material from animal stalls, or bringing kalim to workers to fix, or picking them up from the workers after they've fixed it. And the halacha, the Mishnah says as follows: you're allowed to seat a chicken or a dove on eggs in order that they be warmed properly and they grow and they don't spoil and they should hatch and develop into chicks. If the mother ran away, you're allowed to put it back. If the mother died, you're allowed to get another bird and have it sit on it. Now, as far as the stalls, you're allowed to shovel out from underneath the feet of an animal in its stall on the 14th, on Erev Pesach. On Chol Hamoed, you're not allowed to shovel out, you're only allowed to shovel to the sides and clear some space in the middle. As far as picking up and dropping off kalim from the workers, so you're allowed to do that even if it's not needed for Chol Hamoed itself. So the Gemara is going to analyze these 3 halachos one at a time. The Gemara says, first of all, you told me that I'm allowed to seat the chicken on it, and then you tell me I'm allowed to put the chicken back if it ran away. Obviously, if I'm allowed to sit it there in the first place, I'm certainly allowed to put it back. Says Abaye, the Sefer is talking about Chol Hamoed. Chol Hamoed, you're allowed to put it back, but you're not allowed to seat it there in the first place. Erev Pesach, you're allowed to seat it there in the first place, and certainly allowed to put it back if it ran away. Now, the Gemara limits this halacha about putting back chicken that ran away from the eggs that it's supposed to be sitting on and incubating and hatching. So Gemara says as follows: if it was off the eggs already for 3 days, the eggs are already cooled, they're already spoiled, they will never develop further, and therefore there's no heter to put the chicken back. That Rav Huna says, and everybody agrees to. The Gemara has a machlokas, however, what is there a minimum as to how long the chicken had already been sitting on the eggs before it ran away? Rav Huna says it has to have been sitting there for at least 3 days. Otherwise, it didn't develop enough to be inedible. Developed a little bit, it's a little gross, but people will still eat it. And therefore, you would not be allowed to put the chicken back on. What's the reason? The only heter for putting the chicken back is because of loss, because you're going to lose your eggs. The eggs will become disgusting. So, like we said before, if it's off the eggs already for more than 3 days, it won't save the eggs, and therefore you're not saving yourselves from any loss. Rav Huna adds that if it didn't sit on the eggs for 3 days in the first place, then the eggs are still edible, and therefore there's no loss. You don't have a heter to put the chicken back on. You could eat the eggs the way they are. The Gemara says that not everybody. We said Rav Ami says no, even if it sat on it for less than 3 days, you're still allowed to put the eggs back. And the reason is that now it's in a very poor state. It's edible, but some people will eat it, some people won't, and therefore you won't be able to sell it for much. And therefore there is a loss. It's not a complete loss, it's still edible, but it's somewhat of a loss because you'll be able to sell it for less. Therefore you're allowed to put the chicken back on to save yourself from that loss, to have the eggs develop further and be actually hatched and used as chickens instead of as partially rotten, spoiled eggs. What's a machlokas? The Gemara says, machlokas is how much of a loss do you need to suffer to make it permitted to prevent it on Chol Hamoed? According to Rav Huna, even it has to be a major loss as long as you could still sell it somewhat to some people who will eat it, it's not considered enough of a loss to make you able to put the chicken back. That's a tircha, by the way, that's the malacha that's involved. You have to go chase the chicken down and put it back on. According to Rabbi Ami, even a small loss, the fact that you won't be able to sell it for as high a price, is enough reason for you to be able to chase the chicken down and put it back on. Okay, now we go to the halacha about shoveling out the stalls. We bring a brisa. The brisa seems to be self-contradictory. It says you're allowed to shovel out the waste from the courtyard, but you're not allowed to shovel it out into the garbage heap outside the chutzner. You're just allowed to move it to the sides. But then the second half of the brisa says that in the barn and in the courtyard, you're allowed to move it out to the garbage heap. So we see a contradiction. The first half says you're not allowed to shovel it out of the courtyard. The second half says you are. Just because it adds in the barn doesn't make it a different halacha for the courtyard. So the Gemara gives two explanations over here. The Gemara says that Abaye says that you're allowed to shovel it to the sides on Chol Moed. You're allowed to shovel it all the way out to the garbage heap. That's on Erev Pesach. Rava says, no, both halachas are talking about on Chol Moed. What it means to say is you read the brisa together as one. You're allowed to shovel it to the sides, that's if it's a normal situation. If it became like a barn, meaning the barn, and if the courtyard became like a barn, that it's so full of trash that you have no place to function in there, then you're allowed to actually empty the waste material out of the yard itself into the garbage heap. Now we move on to discuss the final halacha. The Mishnah had said that you're allowed to drop off or pick up kalim from the worker that you need fixed on Yontif. Gemara says Rav Papa said that Rava tested us by asking us a contradiction between this Mishnah and a different Mishnah, which says you're not allowed to drop it off and you're not allowed to pick it up unless you're afraid that it'll get stolen, in which case you're not allowed to bring it home, you're only allowed to move it to the next door yard, meaning the yard that the worker's in, people are likely to steal from, but in the next yard they won't. So a contradiction. Here we said you're allowed to drop it off and pick it up, and in the other Mishnah we say you're not allowed to drop it off and pick it up. That was the question. So it says Rav Papa, we gave him two answers. One answer was you're allowed to on Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to is on Chol Moed. The other answer is you're allowed to, that's if you don't trust the guy and you're afraid he's going to steal it or somebody else will steal it. You're not allowed to if you trust him, you don't have any reason to pick it up, you could leave it there till afterwards. It says Rav Papa, and I will prove to you that this is correct, from a brisa. The brisa says as follows: you're allowed to bring a kalim and pick them up from a worker, like for example a jug from a potter, glass from a glass maker, but not things which are not letzarach yom tov, such as wool from the dyer and other types of kalim from workers that you do not need. Now, the brisa continues and says that if the worker doesn't have what to eat, you're allowed to pay him, and you're allowed to leave it in his house. And if you don't trust him, then you're allowed to move it to the next house over. And if you're afraid it'll be stolen even from there, you could bring it home secretly, quietly, so that nobody sees you on Yom Tov. If you don't want to be mezalzel in Chol Moed, if you're allowed to bring it home quietly. So anyway, what we see from this brisa is that the difference between whether you're allowed to pick it up or not would be whether or not you trust him. So that's the answer. So Gemara says we're going to reject this second answer. The reason is because this only explains the answer to the contradiction as to whether or not you're allowed to pick it up. But we also saw a contradiction between the two Mishnayos as to whether or not you're allowed to drop off your kli. That you haven't answered. That we're going to have to say the difference is whether it's Chol Moed or Erev Pesach. And once we're relying on that, that's the answer that we're going to
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.